Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Creation Myths. Today, we are doing another installment in the Wrong Answers Only series, looking at the New Answers books from Answers to Genesis. Today, we're going to cover chapters 2 and 3 in the New Answers book number 1. So this is not a normal time when I typically do anything. So if you are here watching this live, hi, thank you. I appreciate you being here. If you are here watching this some other time, thank you for watching. I appreciate you watching. I'm doing this today because I have time and the semester is about to start, so things might get busy pretty soon. So I figure I'll get this out while I can before, I no longer have as much time to do it. For everybody that's here, if you want to just give me an audio check, just say we're good. I can hear you fine. Otherwise, I'll try to fix everything. So let me pull up what we're going to talk about today. We are going to cover 2 chapters in Answers in Genesis, the New Answers book, number 1. We've already covered chapter 1 and chapter 2. Today, we are going to cover chapters 3 and 4. We are doing 2 chapters today because these 2 chapters are really light on the biology stuff. So I don't have that much to talk about in these 2 chapters, but I don't just want to skip them. I think the way this series is coming together as I read through this book is I'm not going to skip the chapters that don't have a lot of content I want to comment on. I'll just mention them, point out a couple things, and continue on. And that's what we're going to do today. So chapter 3, we're going to get right into it here. Chapter 3 is by Ken Ham again. So he also wrote chapter 1, and he's got a bunch of chapters throughout these books. This is called Couldn't God Have Used Evolution? And this chapter is very light on any kind of science content. There's a nice illustration of kind of AIG's approach to these things in this chapter. So that's what I'm going to point out here. And then a lot of it is more theology and linguistics. It's about like gap theory and day-age theory and stuff that I don't really care about that much. And also I'm not qualified to comment on, so I'm not going to. So let's just go through this very briefly and look at what Ken Ham says about whether God could have used evolution. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit here. I don't have things to say about these pages, but we'll get to the part where I do have comments in just a moment. Eventually, we'll get to the part that's highlighted, which you can see on the right. There's only 2 little bits of highlighting in here. So here we go. That spacing got a little messy, but that's okay. I wanted the figure on the same page as the first quote, but that's okay. All right. So the first little passage I want to point out here, and you can see this is right at the end of the chapter, right before the references. The battle is not one of young Earth versus old Earth, or billions of years versus 6 days, or creation versus evolution. The real battle is the authority of the Word of God versus man's fallible opinions. And I want to just also go back to right here. Look at this figure, right? You've got on the one side, we have these very like classic old school AIG little cartoony things sprinkled throughout this book. So you've got Holy Bible, it is written, or evolution belief. It is rewritten and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. And now this figure is silly, but it's a really nice illustration of something that pops up more in some of the other chapters I've read in this book. And it's this idea that, well, you can't trust science because it keeps changing. And what Ken Ham either doesn't realize or knows but wants to misrepresent is that the fact that science changes, the fact that we keep, to use his words, rewriting science books, that's a feature, not a bug. Right? That's the point. That's called progress, right? Science is a process, a methodology that allows us to test ideas. The goal being over time, you get less and less wrong, right? That's the point. So if you were to have like on a golden pedestal somewhere, the book of evolution, right? And it starts in 1859 and now it's 2022. Yeah, that book has been rewritten a lot. Why? Because we keep learning new things about how evolution works. That's the point of science. So this is not like, I don't understand this dig at science as a process or as an endeavor. It changes. Yeah, it's supposed to. If it's not changing, we're doing something wrong, because that means we're not learning anything new. Right? So that's the first thing in this chapter, this first little piece. And then the second passage down here is going right back to the title of this chapter. So couldn't God have used evolution to create? The answer is no. A belief in millions of years of evolution not only contradicts the clear teachings of Genesis and the rest of Scripture, but also impugns the character of God. And this, I think, is really interesting, because what Ken Ham is doing here, whether he realizes it or not, is he's making his job a lot harder. Because what he's setting up here is a clear dichotomy. You can pick Christianity or you can pick science, but you can't have both. And that's going to be a big problem for a lot of people who, if they accept that dichotomy, which for the record, you don't need to accept that dichotomy, but for a lot of people who agree that that is a dichotomy, they will come down on the science side of the question. It's not really a great strategy from Ken Ham here. He's basically rejecting a big tent theory, a big tent approach to convincing people that he's right in favor of a very purist approach, right? He's not interested in people accepting Christianity writ large. He wants people to accept Ken Ham's version of Christianity, very specific, very narrow. And if you reject that, even on very specific little issues, that's it. That's the ball game. Incompatible. You're on the other team. And to me, that seems like an unnecessary approach to take, but it also seems self-defeating, because there's, as you may or may not know, I hope most people know this, but if you don't, most Christians accept evolutionary theory, right? Like, I know this is not a popular position among like Ken Ham's flavor, but like the Pope, the Catholic Church, they're cool with evolutionary theory. It's fine. So when you draw the lines this specifically and make it this stark and make your own side this narrow, you're really putting yourself in a box, because what you're going to do is alienate people who might be inclined to agree with you on most of what you're saying. But by making this dichotomy a sticking point, you're going to exclude and alienate those people. So again, this is not like a science question. This is just like a Ken Ham's approach kind of thing. And it strikes me as interesting and not a particularly well thought out strategy for getting people on your side. That's it for this chapter. So let's go on to the next chapter, which is chapter 4. It's called Don't Creationists Deny the Laws of Nature? And it's by Jason Lisle, who I believe is an astrophysicist, but he's also co-authored some stuff with like Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson on like biology stuff. So he does a lot of stuff. So in this chapter, this chapter is a really good illustration of the point of these books and the intended audience of these books, because these books it's the new answers, right? These are answers to questions people get about creationism and evolution and that kind of stuff. These books are intended for an audience that accepts AIG's point of view on these questions, and they are intended to reassure that audience and provide kind of, I'll put it in quotes, evidence that that audience can then use either for themselves to build their own confidence or in conversation with people who disagree with them. And this chapter is a great illustration of this, because at no point in this chapter do we have an attempt to justify the premises of the argument. At no point. We're going to go through a couple passages and we're going to see where he's just like, well, we know X, where a lot of people are going to go, I don't think we do. I think you need to justify that. And they're just like, this is the case, therefore, whatever, without stopping at the premise. So let's take a look at that. Again, it's not a whole lot of biology here I'm going to comment on, but it's an interesting kind of look at how this argument works and how the authors of this book are interacting with their intended audience. So the first thing here, it's right down here, it says the most, and then it goes on the next page, fundamental laws of nature exist only because God wills them to. They're a logical, orderly way that the Lord upholds and sustains the universe he has created. The atheist is unable to account for the logical, orderly state of the universe. And that's just a whole big bundle of assertions that doesn't provide any reason for anybody who doesn't already agree to buy into it, right? There's no attempt to convince here. It's just like stating up front, hey, here's this thing we all agree on. That's going to be the starting point for this chapter, right? So from there, he talks about the law of life or the law of biogenesis. He says, notice that molecules to man evolution violates the law of biogenesis. Evolutionists believe that life, at least once, spontaneously formed from non-living chemicals, but this is inconsistent with the law of biogenesis. Real science confirms the Bible, which we could spend 3 hours unpacking that one line, but instead we're going to ignore it because we have other things to talk about. So this thing, the law of biogenesis, it's not, what he's referring to is in the 1800s. It was a bunch of people worked on this, but most famously Louis Pasteur kind of gets credit for it. He figured out that cellular life only comes from pre-existing cellular life, right? So he did these experiments where we'd have some kind of like nutrient broth and you could grow bacteria in it. But if you boiled it and sterilized it, then nothing would grow in it until you exposed it to the atmosphere. And it's super cool. He's got these like swan neck flasks where it's like it's got the solution in it. It's got this curved neck where stuff from the air can't get in, even though it's actually connected to the atmosphere. Stuff that's like cells is too heavy. It can't get in. And you could actually go to the museum in France and see some of his stuff in his lab from the 1800s that's still sterile. It's super cool. I could nerd out about this forever, but I'm not going to. So what Pasteur described, or what Pasteur did, was refute what was called spontaneous generation, the idea that living cells were constantly forming from non-living things. So like this was the idea that like if you left meat out, like bacteria and maggots would spontaneously form from the meat that was left out, right? It's like, no, that's those living things are coming from somewhere. This is different from what he's talking about here when he's saying this law of biogenesis. He's setting that up in contrast to abiogenesis, which is a separate thing from evolution. It's connected. It involves a bunch of the same processes and mechanisms and principles, but it's a whole separate thing, right? Evolutionary theory, abiogenesis, same mechanisms, same principles, two different sets of ideas, though, in terms of what's happening, okay? So abiogenesis is the idea that approximately 4 billion years ago on an Earth where there was no life, life arose from a non-living precursor state. Okay, that's abiogenesis. That is a different thing from this supposed law of biogenesis, because what's going on with Pasteur and the other people working on this was they're operating in a world where cellular life already exists, right? If you want to state a law of biogenesis, you could potentially state it as cellular life only arises from other cellular life when cellular life is already present. But that does not apply to a planet where there is no cellular life. That's the important caveat there. Because what happens to all the prebiotic chemicals that might be useful for living things that might accumulate and eventually form into living things through abiogenesis? And we're not going to get into the hypotheses and processes there. We could, again, spend hours on that, but we're not going to. What happens to those precursor chemicals in a world where living things already exist? They get gobbled up by the stuff that's already there. If anything useful forms spontaneously in the environment, the cells in that environment use it. So they never accumulate, so you never get abiogenesis once life exists. It almost definitionally is a thing that can only happen once unless, everything goes extinct, and then you can try a second time. So that's kind of the bait and switch that Jason Lisle is pulling here. He's conflating these two different ideas, saying one refutes the other, when they're actually two separate ideas that aren't actually connected to each other. And this is not something that is unique to Jason Lisle. This is something that creationists do pretty frequently when it comes to abiogenesis. So be aware of that. Know it when you see it. Let's continue. Then we talk about, too far. Then we talk about the laws of chemistry. He says, life, as we know it, would not be possible if the laws of chemistry were different. This is just one of those things where it gets into this fine-tuning thing, and we're going to see more of that here. But, I mean, sample size is one, right? We have one universe. We have one way chemistry works. We don't know what else could work. We're just asserting that it couldn't. Okay, fine. But, like, you have to make an argument. You can't just assert it. So that's kind of a theme with this chapter. So let's keep going. We got planetary motion, physics. Here we have talking about things like equals mc squared or F equals ma, these kind of basic laws in physics. It says it's amazing that every object in the universe consistently obeys these rules. I don't think it is, but again, he's kind of, it's a fine-tuning argument, right? Where we'll look at these very specific things. Weird that everything works that way. Must have been put that way. You need to have like an argument there. You need to have a if, therefore, right, kind of situation. You can't just assert it. But again, this is not written to convince me. It's not written to convince somebody who's not already on the AIG bus, right? And that's the idea. He says some laws of physics may be truly fundamental, not based on other laws. Some laws of physics may be truly fundamental. Added a word there, sorry. They exist only because God wills them to. In fact, this must be the case for at least one law of physics and perhaps several, the most fundamental. There's no argument. Do we see a theme here? We're asserting, right? Laws of physics, fundamental laws of physics, therefore God. Some entity had to set the laws. That's, objection. Not, assumes evidence not in the record. Okay? That doesn't have to be the case. And again, this is meant for an audience who is reading this and saying, yep, that checks out. But I read it and I go, why? You haven't even attempted to convince me that this is the case. But again, I'm not the audience. I'm not the target audience. So then we have the very typical fine-tuning stuff. So we have universal constants, as with the laws of physics. Some constants depend on others, whereas some are likely fundamental. God alone has set their value. And then we kind of get a little bit more general, talking about the anthropic principle. The laws of physics, along with their associated constants, are fine-tuned. There it is, fine-tuning. Just the right way so that life, particularly human life, is possible. This, in fact, is called the anthropic principle. God created the fundamental laws of physics in just the right way and gave the constants just the right value so that the other constants and derivative laws of physics would come out in just the right way, so that chemistry would work in the right way, so that the elements and compounds would have the right properties, so that life would be possible. We're just asserting things without trying to make an argument, which is fine for the audience this is intended for. But it's not going to do it for somebody who's not already on board. And you can see how this goes hand in hand with Ken Ham in the previous chapter, right? Ken Ham also not trying to convince people who aren't already on board. He's actively telling people who don't agree with him to get out. You're not welcome here. Lisle is then taking that same group of people and being like, okay, we all agree, right? We're not making an argument. We're not trying to persuade or convince. We're just doing the reassuring thing so that everybody's on the same page and everybody feels okay about it. That's the purpose of this chapter. And it goes really well with the previous chapter, establishing, who's on which team and making this team very narrow. So we don't have that many left to do here, actually. There's just not that many. So the secular naturalist cannot account for the laws of mathematics. Why not? Why can't? Okay, like the Pythagorean theorem, I account for it. I mean, triangles are triangles. They work the way they are. That's what they do. The Pythagorean theorem is what it is. Presumably, in any universe that has triangles, you would have the Pythagorean theorem. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you could have a universe where that's not the case. I don't know. But I don't think the laws of mathematics have to be accounted for, right? It just again, it strikes me as hey, those idiots, they can't explain any of this, right? However, the Christian understands that there is a God beyond the universe, and the mathematics reflect the thoughts of the Lord. Okay, so that is pretty nice kind of encapsulation of this whole approach here. So we have a few more things. Talk about uniformity. The laws of nature apply in the future just as they applied in the past. This is one of the most basic assumptions in all of science. It's not an assumption. We can test that. We can actually test that assumption. Things like the nuclear reactor that I've talked about before. So you can go back and actually see, like, do these laws of nature apply? Things that govern things like nuclear decay and nuclear fission, yeah, they actually do apply. So in conclusion, we have seen that the laws of nature depend on other laws of nature, which ultimately depend on God's will. That we have seen is doing a lot of work there, because we've said it, but we have seen implies that there is evidence, an argument, some kind of logical flow here. And we haven't seen that, I don't think. We're just asserting, again, to make people on the team feel good. And then the last thing here, we expect the universe to be organized in a logical, orderly fashion and to obey uniform laws because the universe was created by the power of God. So we end with this great big assertion, but also I want to just point out the circularity here because we just changed it, right? The whole rest of this chapter was, right, we're starting with God. That's how we have all these laws, right? We have all this orderly, whatever, everything works. Now we're saying, this is now evidence, right? It goes the other way. We expect the universe to be organized this way because it was created by God. So we're actually circularizing this argument by the end of the chapter. So that's all we're going to cover today in the New Answers book #1. That's chapters 3 and 4. Like I said, light on the science. Interesting, though, in terms of the approach that the authors are taking and how they're treating their intended audience here. So our next chapter, we're going to talk about gap and ruin reconstruction theories. We won't talk much about them because I don't have much to say about them, but we'll at least go through the chapter. And that'll be next time in Wrong Answers Only. So thank you for watching. If you haven't already hit like, please hit like. And if you are watching this and for some reason aren't already subscribed, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you next time.